Let's get started because we have a full agenda. All right, welcome to today's teach-in on anti-Asian American violence. My name is Dr. Clement Lai. I go by Clem. My preferred gender pronouns are he, him. I'm an associate professor of Asian American Studies here at Cal State Northridge. And I'm also one of the co-directors of Civil Discourse and Social Change, along with my colleague, Associate Professor Hanam Sheikh. I'll be moderating today's event. I wanted to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement and also have a moment of silence because it is the 1-month anniversary of the killings of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom were Asian American women. So first, our land acknowledgement. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the original caretakers of the land on which California State University Northridge is located. For centuries, this land has been the home of indigenous communities and villages whose lands were stolen, whose members were enslaved with the founding of the San Fernando Mission in 1797. Today, the survivors of this genocide are now known as the Fernandinho Tatavian Band of Mission Indians, who remain stewards of this land. We are honored and grateful to be guests on their traditional lands. Please take the time to acknowledge and build relationships with indigenous communities whose land you occupy, including here in Southern California, the land of the Tongva and the Chumash, and work toward envisioning a world where this land is returned to its stewards. Next, I want to just take a moment to have a moment of silence so we can share the grief with the victims of gun violence in Atlanta who were murdered on March 16th, as well as other victims of gun violence and of state violence who have died recently. All right, thank you very much. On behalf of Civil Discourse and Social Change, I wanted to thank the members of the audience who are Zooming into our webinar today. I also wanted to thank the Office of the Provost, whose support has been instrumental in CDSC's programming these last 10 years. I wanted to thank the deans of the Colleges of Humanities and the Mike Kerb College of Arts, Media, and Communications, Jackie Stahlkup and Dan Hoskins. Special thanks to our partner on this event, the CSUN Asian American Studies Department, otherwise known as the second oldest Asian American Studies department in the United States. And deepest thanks to our wonderful and talented CDSC interns, Raina Johnson Calderon, Jason Kwan, Hannah Adams, and Vivian Lay, as well as our administrative support staff, including Erica Barone and Dakota Hughes. Lastly, I want to thank our panelists, CSUN students Serena Hill, Hannah Adams, and Skylar Hall, and CSUN professors Edith Chen, Jenna Kim, and Hanam Sheikh. And utmost thanks, solidarity, and respect to Manju Kulkarni, Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, otherwise known as APCON, one of the central organizations behind the hashtag #StopAAPIHate, and its website to report hate incidents and hate crimes against Asian Americans under the pandemic. CDSC is a campus-wide initiative that combines education with campus involvement and sustained activism around social justice and social change. CDSC formed 10 years ago in the wake of student activism against tuition hikes during the Great Recession and in support of undocumented students. Today's programming is funded through the California Civil Liberties Public Education Grant. The Civil Liberties Grant is a program of the California Library whose goal is to increase public awareness about the forced removal and incarceration of West Coast Japanese migrants and Japanese Americans during World War II, and to focus more broadly on civil rights and civil liberties violations due to race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, and migration status. This grant then funds programming that helps us try to understand these troubling times. In the wake of nearly 3,800 hate incidents committed since March 2020 through February 2021, while under the pandemic, including physical assaults on and murders of Asian Americans, and the recent murders of 8 Atlanta spa workers, 6 of whom were Asian American, on March 16th, how are we to understand this violence? How is this violence related not just to the pandemic, but also to the history of Asians in America and to the history of the United States' unequal imperial relationships with Asia and the Pacific? What does this violence, how does this violence intersect with a hypersexualization of Asian women? And what can be and is being done about this violence nationally and locally? Lastly, CSUN. How have these incidents affected Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Desi American students at CSUN? What is the status of these students at CSUN? And how can CSUN take concrete measures to address the needs of these students, not just in response to the pandemic and to anti-Asian American violence, but also in terms of equity at an institution that proclaims its support for diversity and inclusion, but in so many ways arguably does not know about and does not truly see its Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Desi American students and their communities. These are some questions and issues that we hope to address in today's teach-in. Ideally, it will be one part of a much deeper conversation that needs to happen. Before we go into self-introductions of the panelists, I just want to briefly note the format. In the first half hour, our panelists will discuss recent anti-Asian American violence and will address the history's roots and manifestations of Asian American and anti-Asian American violence. This will be followed by a 15-minute discussion on how incidents have been affecting the CSUN Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Desi American community, and overview of community-based solutions that have been developed in the wake of this violence. In the third part of the program, we turn to CSUN's Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Desi American communities to hear perspectives from 3 CSUN students on these incidents, and to hear their perspectives on what care and support for these students should look like. We conclude with audience Q&A. And now to self-introductions.
I can go first. Welcome everybody. It's really nice to see your names in the panel on the side, I guess. My name is Khanam Sheikh, and I'm a professor of gender and women's studies at CSUN, and I'm also the co-director of the Center for Civil Discourse and Social Change.
I can go next. I'm Edith Chen, professor of Asian American Studies. This is my 20th year in the department. The classes that you can commonly find me in is Introduction to Asian American Studies. I see some of my students here, as well as Asian American women. I'm also one of the principal investigators for a research study on Asian Americans in health.
I can go next. My name is Jenna Kim, and I'm an associate professor in communication studies at CSUN, and also a faculty affiliate in Asian studies. I'm also on the executive board for the Association for Asian American Studies, where I work with the Comfort Women section. And my scholarship overall looks at gender-based violence in the US and across the Trans-Pacific.
I can go next. Hi, everybody. My name is Serena Hill. I am a junior here at CSUN, and I am a communication studies major. I am interested at the role that communication plays within power structures. And I also organize with an organization called Third World Power. And I work with a variety of different groups on social justice issues.
I could go next. Hi, everybody. My name is Skylar Hall. My pronouns are he, they. I am also a third year at CSUN, and I'm majoring in political science with a double minor in Asian American Studies and civic and community engagement. And I like to focus my work on equitable, sustainable, community-based solutions to aid and to advocacy. And I am also an intern in the Asian American Studies Pathways Project, which is a student resource initiative here at CSUN for our AAPI students in the broader CSUN community. And it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you, and thank you for being here. My name's Hannah Adams. I'm a Pacific Islander student studying marketing as an undergraduate senior, and I am a CDSC intern.
Manju.
Hi, everyone. My name is Manju Kulkarni. I am Executive Director of APCON, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. We're a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations that together serve and represent the 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. I'm also the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, and finally a lecturer at UCLA in Asian American Studies.
Thank you for those introductions, everyone. We're going to jump right into the program. We're going to start with Manju Kulkarni, who's going to sort of give us a little bit of an overview of the recent incidents of anti-Asian violence and some of the work that's being done within the community. So Manju, would you like to share your slides?
Yes. Can you see them, Hanum?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, let me hold on here. And I just want to say before I start, really what an honor and pleasure it is to be with all of you today. Really appreciated the invitation that I got from my dear friend Hanum, whom I've known for so many years, and who's actually spoken at events that I've hosted, as she really is a leader in the South Asian American community and the broader AAPI community. I also want to just do a shout out to my other dear friend, Deborah Hammond, who I know is a key part of CSUN, and just really, again, so privileged to be in a space with such distinguished leaders and all of the panelists today. So I wanted to start off by sharing with you what we've seen at Stop API Hate. These are examples that really are emblematic of incident reports we've received directly from individuals across the country. I'm not going to read them, but you can read them, and I'll just share with you, going clockwise from the top left-hand corner, example of a refusal of service by a ride-hailing company. The middle example of elderly grandparents being accosted in their neighborhood. The one on the right of a physician who was berated by his patient. Beneath that, a physical altercation involving racial slurs. The middle example, which was shared on social media, of a tech executive from the Bay Area, not only making racist remarks, but actually weaponizing President Trump. And then finally, the case on the bottom left that got us started on this issue here in Los Angeles, a middle school child who was physically attacked and verbally assaulted on the schoolyard. A bully approached him, said, "You're a COVID carrier," and told him to go back to China. And when he said he was not Chinese American, he was punched in the face and head 20 times. What's noteworthy about that incident is that it took place before there was a single confirmed case of COVID-19 in Southern California. And also the sad fact that it really had already the racism had infiltrated into the minds and hearts of our young people. So it was because of incidents similar to these that we, and in fact, that last one, that AppCon, along with Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco State, launched Stop AAPI Hate in March of last year. Being trusted organizations in AAPI communities with over a century's worth of experience, we understood the community. We knew how important creating a forum in multiple Asian languages was, doing outreach, and making that form available to limited English proficient communities. And so it was because of that we immediately received several hundred incident reports from across the country, all 50 states and the District of Columbia. That number as of the end of February is at 3,800. We've received actually a significant number in March, and we'll be releasing that report in the next 10 days. The vast majority of these are hate incidents and not hate crimes. And that's really important to remember. I know there's been a lot of media attention, both in social media as well as in news accounts, of hate crimes. And those are certainly to be taken very seriously. But 90% or more are really those that don't involve an underlying criminal element. So it's important for us to think of community-based solutions, to think of comprehensive approaches. And so I want to share that data point with you. Individuals from all parts of our community have reported to us, and women have really borne the brunt of the hate against our communities, reporting 68% of those that we've received. Seniors also have experienced it at high levels, along with youth at 10%. And so when we look at the types of bias or discrimination, what tops the list is verbal harassment or name calling at 68%. I want to share that these are not mutually exclusive categories. So someone who reports to us can check verbal harassment, also physical assault, also workplace discrimination. And you'll see physical assaults at 11%. What's also noteworthy is, of course, the bottom 4, which fall under the rubric of civil rights violations: workplace discrimination, refusal of service, vandalism, and being barred from transportation. When we look at the sites of incidents, we see that a significant number happen at businesses. So that makes us also think about what are the right solutions in place, right? As we address systemic and structural racism that come from our business sector. Then we look at public streets, public parks, public transit, combined make up about 45%. And then lastly, I want to point to schools and universities, which we think is a relatively low number, mostly resulting from the fact that many schools have been virtual for the last year. LA Unified just opened up this week. We know too that universities still are going largely virtual in terms of classes. And so unfortunately, we expect that number to rise once we move to in-person. And in fact, Asian American parents have said that they are worried about their kids starting back at school. When we look at this slide about the targeted populations, ethnically, I think Chinese Americans do make up a plurality, followed by Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, etc. I want to point to a few different things here. The Asian American category are folks who are multiracial or identify more broadly as Asian and not with a specific ethnic group. You'll see white, Hispanic, or Latino or Latinx and African American. These are either individuals who are biracial, multiracial, or that have witnessed a report and so have reported it to us. So those are also firsthand accounts. But of course, if they don't identify as Asian American, they are reporting as witnesses. And I want to mention 2 groups that are unfortunately not on this chart, which are Pacific Islanders and South Asians. So we have received incident reports from both populations. They were less than 1%, which is why they're not on this chart. But for example, Pacific Islanders have experienced, at least when reporting to us, incidents that are very similar to ones experienced by members of the Asian American community. Similarly, South Asians have reported the same, even though they may not be perceived as East Asian and part of that targeted category. That data is also backed up by AAPI data, which has found that 10% of Pacific Islander community members have experienced something in the last year, and 12% of Asian Americans. So when we look at the impacts, they're quite significant, observing that there's been a 155% increase in depression. We are actually issuing a mental health report in the next couple of weeks where we surveyed our respondents, and we know that other researchers have done the same in terms of looking at the impacts of this hate against our communities. And then also in terms of just high rates of unemployment, small business closures. And we know that it's not just individual impacts, but also that of policies like public charge, deportation of Southeast Asians, other anti-immigrant policies. And so as I close, I want to just share with you our 4-pronged approach, which is not only as a reporting center to track and analyze what's happening, also trying to raise awareness through education efforts like the one today and media, providing community resources and direct assistance. And that's something that we're doing both on our website and then also through local collaboratives, which I'll talk about in a minute. And finally, advocating for effective solutions at local, state, and national levels. I had an opportunity to testify in front of Congress and share the same data that I'm sharing with you today about what's happening just days after the Atlanta incident. So in terms of working together, we certainly want all of you to report incidents and encourage your friends, neighbors, and colleagues to do the same. Identifying information you share is kept confidential and not provided to anyone without your explicit permission. And I just want to say too, we are working with our collaborative partners to provide legal assistance, facilitating anti-bias trainings with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, alongside community mediation efforts. I spoke already about policy change, talking to the governor's office. We had a meeting with the governor last week, as well as regular meetings with the API Legislative Caucus here in California. And we're working in collaboratives to lead public safety initiatives. There's some terrific programs in the Bay Area where there are community ambassador programs and individuals, including those who were formerly incarcerated, actually walking and serving as ambassadors. Those are often individuals from other communities, African American and Latinx, walking with and providing safety for our Asian American Pacific Islander elders. And then here in LA, we have a program called LA versus Hate, where individuals, not only in the AAPI community, but others, can call 211, report an incident, and get direct help from APCON and other organizations, mental health services, civic engagement help, legal resources, et cetera. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for listening and welcome any questions and hearing the dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Manju, for this comprehensive and detailed sort of overview of what's happening. And I also want to say I thank you so much for joining us at CSUN. But as you said, I've known you for way before I was at CSUN. Manju has been an activist and an advocate for a few decades now. And it's just incredible to be able to draw on our resources outside of CSUN also and be in this conversation. And I value the work that you do. And I thank you for providing that overview. And while the statistics and stuff give us such a sort of larger view, and some of the stories that Manju had on the slide, one of the things that we wanted to also highlight is that these experiences of hate incidents or hate crimes are really real and really embodied, and we experience them in a daily kind of way. And there is a lot of fear and a fear of being out in public for many who sort of are being targeted. And so we wanted to just actually ask some of the panelists if they could, just in a minute or two, if you could just talk about what has this kind of violence or hate meant in your daily life? Like, what is the experience of this like? And we could maybe, Serena, maybe you could lead us in this.
Yeah, I can speak to this. So there's definitely there's definitely fear, there's definitely anger, and I think that hate crimes and violence against the AAPI community, I think it manifests itself in different ways. I think that it can be harassment, it can be physical assault, it can be avoidance, intentional avoidance, or it comes across in everyday ways, as you mentioned. And for myself and my own experiences, just everyday things like going out for a run or going to the grocery store. I had an experience at the beginning of COVID where I was running and someone pretty much said, hey, like, stay away from me because you're Asian, you're gonna get me sick. And, I just ran, kept going, tried to brush it under the rug, which is something that I think a lot of AAPI people and folks try to do because that's very, that's a nuance in our culture, but it's something that needs to be addressed. And then I also live alone. I don't live alone, I live with my partner, but I don't live at home. So my mother is very scared for me. She's always telling me, make sure that you are aware of your surroundings, and just making sure that I am always aware and conscious, because I don't know if I might be a target. And I also worry for her safety as well. So that's how it's affected me.
Thank you, Serena. Edith, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the pandemic in March, when we kind of knew more about it, I remember, I would halfway joke around with my Asian American friends and say, Well, I don't know what to be more fearful of, getting COVID or getting attacked because I'm Asian American. In the beginning, when there was this mask controversy, I wanted to wear a mask. It's something that people in Asia do normally, even before COVID, to protect themselves from flu, etc. So I had some masks, but I remember I'm going to go to Costco, but I don't want any extra attention to myself, an Asian wearing a mask, right? So things like that, the fear of just what could happen, because I'm sure these events, people, the lady that got attacked just a couple weeks ago in Riverside, just from walking her dog, got stabbed and killed. The Burmese man and his two young sons in Texas that were Sam's Club. They were just grocery store shopping and got knifed. I mean, it could, they weren't anticipating, right? And so it's kind of things like that, just an awareness that it could happen to any of us, and it does restrict one's movement and makes you double think of things that you should and shouldn't do.
Thank you, Edith. Clem, did you want to add here also?
Sure. So, since March of 2020, I have, the one thing that has happened to me, and generally when I'm out, and I'm the main person in my family who goes out all the time for groceries and to walk the dog and that sort of thing. But mainly what's happened to me is someone has coughed deliberately in my presence, and that was one thing. And then another time, I don't know if this is related to me being Asian American, but I did notice a pickup truck slowed down deliberately, and they rolled down the window. I was getting ready for them to say something, but they ended up just telling me that my dog was really very ugly. And aside from that, what that reminded me of, and what this climate of hate incidents remind me of, is growing up in La Cañada. That's not very far from CSUN, and my brothers and I used to be physically threatened, verbally threatened and physically assaulted, K through 12. And I often remember things like having my glasses shoved into my eyeball and being tripped and that sort of thing. But also our house was vandalized quite frequently, usually around Halloween, and a lot of times around December 7th. So around Pearl Harbor Day. So to this day, I actually usually get pretty nervous around Halloween. I don't like Halloween. And eggs getting thrown at the house and that sort of thing, and our porch getting vandalized with paint and whatnot. But that's the same with December 7th. And I think in general, I'm also very fearful for my parents. They no longer live in La Cañada. They moved to Sacramento, and I worry about them a lot and what might happen to them.
Thanks for sharing those personal experiences. I am going to move into our second section, which is sort of some histories of anti-Asian violence, sort of the roots and some of the histories. And Professor Jinna Kim is going to start us off in this section to sort of give us a little bit of an overview of how do we understand these incidents of hate in a larger historical and global perspective.
Thank you. Thank you to CDSC for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I've been asked to speak on the histories of anti-Asian racial violence in the US and the connection to US imperialism and militarism in Asia, which I'll try to do so by thinking through the Atlanta shootings, which occurred on March 16th. Of the 8 people who were killed that day, 6 were Asian American women killed at their workplace. There were immigrant women, mothers, single women, elderly women working beyond the retirement age. And we know that they were working in the service industry, not because they wanted to, but because as immigrant working class women of color with limited English, limited resources, limited support from the broader co-ethnic community, they didn't have a lot of options. This work made them vulnerable to abuse from the people they served, from heightened policing, and from receiving shame from members of their community. So here are the characteristics of anti-Asian violence that we can understand via this mass killing. First, the immediate argument made by the mass shooter and accepted by the police was that he perpetrated these murders because he saw these women as vectors of abnormal sexuality that can infect him. This association of Asian women with disease aligns his rhetoric with the Kung flu and China virus stereotypes. It indicates a long history of representations of Asian Americans as diseased bodies who negatively impact the social mores of the nation and are thus deserving of surveillance, violence, and ejection. And I know Clem will speak more to this, but Filipinos are associated with leprosy, Chinese with smallpox, Japanese with the bubonic plague. This is a long history. 2, the sexualization of these women is indicative of the long American history of representing Asian American sexuality and gender identity as deviants, which in turn works to dehumanize us and treat us as objects. You don't have to look hard to find representations of Asian American women as sexual toys for white American men in popular culture. You should ask your Asian women friends how many times they've been told by American men that they want to date Asian women because they have yellow fever and that they want Asian women to love them long time. This sexualization is legitimated in law and policing, with the 1875 Page Law being a historical precedent. This law was meant to prohibit prostitutes from entering the US, but was only applied against the Chinese. 3, the association of these women with prostitution, despite the fact that they are not, speaks to how Asian American women are associated with sex work and sexualized, regardless of labor. Think about how white women who do massage would never be conflated with prostitution. However, creating conditions for prostitution and other vulnerable labor in the service sector for Asian women is a continued US enterprise. One example is the US military. The US has an empire of military bases in Asia, including the Philippines, Korea, Okinawa, and the Pacific Islands. And wherever there are military bases, they have also set up formal and informal prostitution camps that are regulated by the US military to ensure that their soldiers get to rest and relax, but do not spread or get venereal diseases. Many of the women who work in these camp towns are vulnerable women and are subject to heightened and invasive surveillance to ensure that their bodies are fit for American men to purchase. Due to the power dynamics at play, even Asian women who do not work in sex work are treated as objects available for American male consumption and subject to frequent violence. This shooting brought to mind the rape of a 12-year-old Okinawan child in 1990s by the US military soldiers in Okinawa, and the brutal murder of Yun Kun Yi by US military soldier Kenneth Markle in 1990. 4, much like the violence against African Americans, watching images of violence against Asians and Asian American bodies is a central part of American culture. I've argued in my book that the US needs to reproduce images of Asian bodies in pain to legitimate, for example, US wars in Asia, to produce victims to rescue, and to legitimate enemies who need to be annihilated. War films, especially films about US wars in Asia, are one of the most popular American genres. Since the 1800s, the US has been in a constant and aggressive state of war making in Asia, from the Opium Wars in China to the 1898 Spanish-US War, which led to the colonization of the Philippines, to Japan in World War II, the Korean War in 1950s, war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in the 1960s and 70s, to the covert wars in Pakistan and India in the 70s and 80s, to the expanding US military bases and colonization of the Pacific Islands. In these popular culture, Americans have developed an appetite to revel in the mass killings and deaths of numerous faceless, historyless Asians. Finally, the history of anti-Asian violence in the US is over 200 years old. It's not well known, or it's erased or overwritten by the popular images of Asian Americans as overachieving model minorities. This stereotype exists despite the fact that the poorest immigrant groups across metropolitan cities are Asian Americans, with a quarter in New York City, for example, living below the poverty line in a report published in 2017. So here's a brief and partial history of mass killings and violence before Atlanta. In 2012, a known white supremacist entered a Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, killing 6 people. In 2015, 3 UNC students of Syrian and Palestinian descent were killed in the parking lot by an angry neighbor. Simmering anti-Muslim violence since 9/11 has skyrocketed. White supremacists calling themselves dot busters targeted South Asians throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Southeast Asian Americans in the 1990s in Philadelphia were targeted for violence. In 1989 in Stockton, California, 5 Southeast Asian children, members of refugee communities, were killed in their own schoolyard. In 1982, Vincent Chin was murdered right before he was to be married in Detroit, mistaken for being Japanese and blamed for the downturn in the US auto industry. And to go back to the colonization of the West and Southwest, while lynching is something we associate with the US South, in the US West, lynching was used mainly against the Chinese and Mexican peoples in the late 1800s and 1900s. In 1871, there was a Chinese massacre of Los Angeles, where 15 Chinese men were lynched. In 1885, during the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, 28 Chinese men were killed and their homes set on fire. 1885 and 1886, over 186 communities in the West expelled their Chinese. And it goes on. Accompanying these violence was the vilification of Asians as inassimilable others, stealing American jobs, disease carriers, and sexual deviant beings deserving of violence. Thank you for providing the space to have this discussion.
I just want to thank you, Professor Kim, for that overview. I want to bring it, I want to share some experiences teaching Asian American women, which also Professor Shaikh does too, and who's in gender and women's studies, and we occasionally borrow her in Asian American studies. So I teach Asian American Studies 340 Asian American women. Like I said, I've been at the university for over 20 years. And when I first started teaching Asian American women, the internet was still kind of in the newer phase. And one of the things that I wanted to get across to students is, in an exercise to see what are the more dominant prevailing images of Asian and Asian American women, I said, I want you to go do a Google search and type in Asian American women and print out the images that you find. And we're going to then tape this on the blackboard or the whiteboard. And so students were astounded to find that most of the images are very sexualized, racialized images of Asian women. And that was just a demonstration of the, Asian American women, the intersection of being racialized and sexualized. You can't entangle the two. Of course, now we have more content, right, on the media, thank goodness, more humanistic and multidimensional images, but those still prevailing images still do exist and play themselves out in everyday normalized ways from what you can see on the images or lack of images of Asian American women in the media, and which can also translate to what Jenna said, like the Asian fever, yellow fever, etc., which is specific to Asian American women.
Hi, thank you very much, Edith. So actually, we're gonna, in the interest of time, because I know Manju has to go to another meeting. Maybe we could move now to Manju, you sharing some community-based solutions and resources that the audience can benefit hearing about around anti-Asian American violence.
Sure. So I began to share some of these in my presentation. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm having bad allergies today, folks. So in terms of what we're looking at here in Los Angeles, there are a couple of different efforts that folks can get involved in. And then I know that not only are there similar efforts in the Bay Area, but also in New York, and really in a lot of different parts of the country. And I think, before I share those, I want to just say too how heartened I am by the dialogue that's being started by young people in terms, even on social media, young folks talking about their experiences. I know in the chat, some of us shared our own, and, including some of their stories about, the fact that they've been asked where they're from or where they're really from, having or being on the receiving end of hypersexualized and racist comments as young women, a number of things, including also too, I've seen that Korean and Chinese American adoptees with white parents are also even challenging their parents and letting them know for the first time that they have experienced racism even while being in a white family. I wanted to also just make two other really quick remarks in response to the wonderful feedback I've gotten in Professor Kim's amazing presentation, which is, I think we have talked about how our cultures, maybe have encouraged us to be more silent or to not speak about what's happened. But what I want to also acknowledge in this moment is how we're being silenced. And so, we shouldn't take the onus on ourselves, right? The way systemic racism works is that we are discouraged in every possible way from sharing these stories, right? We know that when we do share them, it prevents us from getting hired. It prevents us from moving up the ladder, whether it's in academia or corporate America, even in nonprofit spaces. I know for myself, it's been hard to challenge, especially a lot of times progressive white folks who think that they're really open to what's happening and actually, in fact, have served as perpetrators. So, I think that this is really that opportunity to understand that it is hard for us to talk about these things. Not dissimilar from women, talking about the sexual violence they experience. We know from the Me Too movement as well that individuals have women have experienced sexual harassment over their lifetimes and very rarely had been able to share that. So in terms of what we see on the community level, what I'll share is that in LA, there is something called the LA versus Hate Action Committee. And if folks are interested after this session, I can share that link with the organizers. And if it's something that you all are interested in participating in, because we really do want to widen the circles of conversation and talk about what solutions are needed at every level, right? It's not enough to do work just with businesses. It's not enough to just have changes in policies, even though both of these are important. I think also in our classrooms, in high school and college, just as we're doing here today. I do want to share one other resource before I talk about some other parts of the country, which is we held a youth internship program and last year there were 100 young people from across the country that participated in the program, and 20 of those young people wrote a report called "They Blame Me Because I Was Asian" or "Because I'm Asian," and you can find that under our reports. And what's really notable about this is they talked to 900 of their friends and classmates. And that report comes out of those conversations and recommendations that young people, high school students made to adults, to us, to let us know this is what we need in our universities. This is what we need in our schools. So I want to just encourage folks, and if I can, I'll share that also in the chat, but it's again, it's called "They Blame Me Because I'm Asian." Also, in terms of other community programs, we know that in addition to ambassador programs, there have been in the Bay Area really multiracial collaboratives bringing together African-American, Latinx, and Asian community members. And this is actually nothing new. I want to say that these programs have been around for a long time. And looking at community solutions very broadly, right? Not just about hate and hate crimes, but what does it mean to have safe housing, safe and affordable housing? What does it mean to have access to education? What does it mean to have jobs that pay a living wage? So for us, it's much broader, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share that with you. Similarly, in Los Angeles, APCON was one of the organizations after the LA uprising, or SAIGU, where we brought together Korean American and African American communities. There was heightened tension after what happened. And we have to remember what brought it on. It was not individual community members from communities of color. It was the lack of appropriate responses by law enforcement, by white supremacists, right? So when we think about it more broadly, right, we know that the Rodney King incident itself was so horrific and brought on by what was a extremely racist police force for many, many decades. And then what happened is when there was a time for them to respond in terms of some of the looting and violence, they actually just essentially sat on their hands. So folks are right that it is around the corner on April 29th. Thank you for sharing that. So we are continuing to do some of that work right now. I want to share as well, if folks are interested, one other thing before I go, which is APCON is part of a collaborative called the People's Block to get individuals from the community to participate in redistricting. We know that voter suppression is part of life now. In fact, one of our political parties has really ensconced itself with voter suppression and white supremacy. And as a result of that, it's so important for us to be vigilant, not only against those type of laws, but against gerrymandering and other ways to dilute the vote of people of color. So the People's Block, and I will share that resource as well. If any of you are interested in participating in the next several months, we need you all to testify, talk about your communities, talk about what you want to see in terms of representation. And for me, what's important about this is we're not looking at hate microscopically. We are looking at the institutions that bring about hate really over the many decades that Professor Kim talked about. And are with us even today. Sadly, I mean, I describe it as being like a geyser, which is, unlike Yellowstone, we don't know that it doesn't necessarily happen every 90 minutes, but we know that sadly, white supremacy shows itself in very forceful ways across days and months of our lives. And this is a moment in which we're seeing it not only against our communities, but against African-American communities by the killings that have happened recently, including of a seventh grader. And what we know to be happening in terms of immigration enforcement against young people coming over from our neighboring countries. So just want to kind of share that with you in a broader way. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. Again, it was such a privilege, and really love opportunities to be in spaces with community folks like you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manju. We're really, really grateful and honored to have you speak at our events. And we are thankful for the work that you do and the work that Stop AAPI Hate is doing in APCON. I found some of the links that you're talking about, except for I think the last one, I put them in the chat. But thank you for your time. We look forward to continued conversation, and hopefully you come back to CSUN really soon. And so, thank you. I just wanted to underscore that it's important to understand the context behind anti-Asian American violence. And we've had powerful testimonies from many of the panelists, and I'm sure our students will also have their own perspectives to bring in. I wanted to underscore, as Asian American Studies professor, one of the ways to understand these attacks that are going on right now is to understand that Asian Americans, the way that they've been racialized, made as racial others, is in terms of foreignness, right? And so the assumption that no matter how many generations an Asian American has been in the United States, that they are always a foreigner, an outsider, or also an enemy alien, right? And the other way foreign racialization works is to lump all Asians together. So generically, they are outsiders or enemies. And so that's playing out when you see who is being attacked right now. Since March of 2020 with hate incidents, it's across the board, different ethnicities and nationalities, right? But we've been to this place before, right? And most recently, after 9/11, when members of the CDSC American community were being targeted, and we're going to hear a few comments from Professor Sheikh right now about 9/11 and hate crimes, and also transnational dimensions of that.
Thank you, Clem. So as I'm listening to all this, I wanted to share just really quickly that, the other day I was driving, and there was an older East Asian woman who was trying to cross the street, and I stopped so that she could pass. And I was looking at her because I wanted her to know that I'm not gonna drive in front of her, and I kept looking at her, and then I noticed she kept looking back, and she sped up. And I was confused. I was like, why is she not? I mean, I was really nicely trying to say, you can go. And I saw her actually get afraid and go a different direction really fast. And it occurred to me that, I am part of, but I'm originally from Pakistan, and I was born in Los Angeles, and the Asian American community is so diverse, and that there's so many sort of differences within. Also, I'm not sort of overtly racialized as what is considered Asian often in America, in the US. And so I actually, in this particular moment, may actually come across as somebody who could be fear producing, So it was an interesting moment, and it dawned on me. There's different moments in which we experience this kind of fear differently. And I remember when September 11th, 2001 happened, I was actually in Pakistan visiting my parents. And I also at the same time worked at what is now Advancing Justice, Asian Americans Advancing Justice. It used to be called APALC, Asian Pacific American Legal Center in downtown LA. And I also taught one class part-time at Cal State Fullerton at that time. And I landed at LAX about 10 days after September 11th, so around the 22nd. And I landed in a climate of intense securitization and fear and surveillance. And I remember so clearly just landing and getting sort of accosted by the Customs and Border Patrol agent, and who kept me for about 30 minutes or something. And the line of questioning was this: you're coming from Pakistan, yes. Do you know Pakistan is a terrorist country? Well, I'm not sure what to say. Why did you visit Pakistan? What do you do here? What kind of affiliations do you have in Pakistan? Are you religious as a Muslim? And it just kind of went on in a way that I didn't know what they wanted from me, except for to sort of show that I'm really grateful to be in this country, and that I was not threatening to this country, and that I belong, and I'm a real American, right? And actually, the only other time I've experienced something like that was when I was at the border of Israel, and trying to go to Palestine, at the border, But so it was kind of, and I remember scrambling. I said, I teach. I used my education credentials. I didn't have a PhD then, but still, I thought, I'll pull in my, I teach at Cal State. And he said, do you have proof? And I remember trying to call, like scrambling to find the phone number of my boss, who was a white woman, in the evening to just figure out if I could get her on the phone so she could verify that I'm a legit person in this country. Now, I'm born in Los Angeles. I had a US passport, you know? So, I mean, it's a tiny moment, right? But it sort of goes back to this question that Clem was raising about foreigner racialization, but also what Jenna raised about sort of the transnational dimensions of this, where does hate come from and how does it get sort of posited onto our bodies and our beings, and what are our responses then, right? In that moment when he wants me to prove that I'm something, you know, and I don't know what to say, you know, if I say what I really mean, I might not make it to my apartment, you know, in that moment. So this was a time of, you know, some of you may remember, of intense surveillance, a lot of overnight, a lot of Muslims were being deported in the dark of the night. This was also, I remember going to the mosque for prayers on Eid, and actually the surveillance was not very covert. It was, I remember people in suits, like white people in suits, standing in the mosque while prayer was happening after Ramadan, like, so a big celebration, with notepads like this, and literally looking at you and taking notes. And us looking and being like, really? Like, you're not even gonna use hidden cameras or something, you know? But that's just kind of how it was. And a lot of relatives and family friends, we were getting visits from FBI. And a lot of phones were tapped. We weren't sure. Me and my brother thought that ours was probably tapped as well, but you know, there was no way of verifying any of this. So it was a time of deep surveillance in every space, mosques, homes, other spaces. And you know, in a climate of such intense fear and surveillance, like what should the response be, right? And immediately, many Muslims put up flags in their businesses and their homes and their cars, and immediately many Muslim women took off their hijabs, which they had worn forever, right, to mark any external markers of difference, of Muslimness. You know, and I remember so many people I know being in this kind of a dilemma, and it was painful. And one of the response though was understandably so, right? Was, we're the good Muslims. We're not like those ones, right? The terrorist ones, the fundamentalists and stuff. And we are as American as other Americans, and we belong in this country. And I understand that response. And at the same time, my parents live in Pakistan and all my relatives live in Pakistan. And we were waiting to find out if the US was going to bomb Pakistan or not, right? There was sort of geopolitics, and the Pakistani government had to make a decision whether they're going to ally, and they were going to bomb Afghanistan. And so we were living in a lot of fear about sort of what was going to happen on that front to people we loved on the other part of the world, you know? And I worked at Advancing Justice at this time. And I remember feeling really unsatisfied, you know, in the nonprofit world of how do we address these things, that the entire energy went into hate crimes, documentation and hate crimes, working with the Human Relations Commission and doing hate crimes and anti-bias training. And any statement that was written, we had to say, I condemn these terrorist activities. And I, you know, there was two parts to it. I think make a claim that we uphold the values of this nation and we belong here, right? And then two, I condemn. And I remember raising this point that we can't just frame our activism in terms of sort of, I need to be included in this nation state, right? It's important. I mean, I understand that we have to make claims for the law, towards the law for inclusion. You know, civil rights are really important, but that can't be the sort of end of the project or the agenda, right? And I remember arguing within the organization and hearing back that many of our funders would not fund us if we strayed from this framing of sort of individual hate and bias and hate crimes being the primary sort of ways in which we think about this. So, you know, I mean, I want to just pivot. I mean, I felt really frustrated, but I also thought about the limitations of the ways that we organize or respond, and how it is really important to respond through state protections and legal protections, but that is one dimension of our activism or the work that we do, right? How do we keep on deepening our strategies and our analysis in how we respond to violence, you know. And this moment right now, then I just want to turn to, I did not check the time then when I started, but I'm just going to take maybe 2 more minutes. I want to just pivot to this current violence, you know, at this current moment, you know. And I just want to say that, you know, when we had the last presidential debates, or when Trump came into power, right, you know, I was shocked by China was anchored as this huge looming enemy, right? Like a human rights violator, a virus producer, a trade undercutting, a job loss, sort of like the jobs are being lost, right? But there was a really deep, I mean, there was the sort of immigrants coming from Central America and Mexico who were taking our, you know, resources. There was the Muslims at the border and the refugees who were civilizationally threatening our ideals and our human rights records, right? And there was China undercutting in every speech. It was looming as one of the largest enemies. Chinese goods are undercutting our economy and our jobs and bringing viruses, right? So I just want to say that some of this hate was authorized, or, you know, at the sort of highest level of the state. And so when we're talking about this as sort of individual hate crimes, it's not bad people who are attacking regular people. These are structurally nation state produced sort of discourses of empire, actually, right? There's so it's a competition of power, and I think our responses have to sort of also take into account these multiple sites of power. I just, you know, will end with, I think I've gone over my time, just asking, you know, as how can these moments help us to think about expanding the politics of our visibility that goes deeper than multiculturalism, right? And nation state boundaries, right? If invisibility is an issue in the AAPI community, let us ask right now, how do we want to be visible, and in what sort of a nation and world, right? So we think about all those simultaneously. And I'll stop there. I'll stop there so we can move to the next segment of our panel.
Thank you, Autumn. Thank you for your powerful testimony and your fantastic points. We're going to turn now to CSUN, and we're going to hear from perspectives from 3 CSUN students, and on this current anti-Asian American violence, on solutions, and on the status of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Desi Americans at CSUN. Before the students speak, I just really want to quickly show some data from CSUN Counts in terms of the numbers of Asian American and Pacific Islander students at CSUN, and you know, the important thing to note is the numbers of those students are declining, right? And I also want to argue that these are communities that the CSUN administration maybe doesn't really know that much about, and maybe in many ways doesn't really actually see. All right, so really briefly, Asian Americans are aggregated together. They're not disaggregated by separate ethnic groups, and are classified by the administration as a better served community, like white students. Pacific Islanders are vastly underrepresented in higher education, and they're not discussed at CSUN in terms of being an underrepresented community of color. But the numbers of those students have been declining, and I just wanted to show you the graphs from CSUN Counts. All right, and so the data is available all the way back to fall 1993 until fall 2020, and you know, I decided to go all the way back to fall 1993 because I was a student at CSUN. I was a master's student in a geography program starting in fall of 1993, and I stayed for about 2 years before I got in a PhD program in geography at UC Berkeley. And as I mentioned before, Pacific Islander students are underrepresented in higher education. When I began as a master's student at CSUN, There are 72 Pacific Islander students, but that was, they were 0.3% of the undergraduate student population in that year. In fall of 2011, when I began my job at CSUN, there are 89 Pacific Islander students, so that's 0.28%, 0.28% of the undergraduate population. But currently, the data that we have most recently in fall, those numbers have dropped drastically since beginning in fall of 2012. But by fall of 2020, there are only 46 Pacific Islander students at CSUN, and that's 0.13% of the undergraduate student population. So that raises the question of what sort of programming or even culturally appropriate personnel are available at CSUN to meet the needs of these students, to recruit and retain them. Now for Asian American students, again, these are aggregated statistics, all ethnic groups together. And in fall of 2013, when I was a master's student at CSUN, there were 3,441 Asian American undergraduates. That's 16.1% of the undergraduate student population. But by fall of 2020, those numbers have dropped to 3,000. I mean, it's been up and down, but they're currently at 3,245. That's 9.5%. I mean, 9.4% of the undergraduate student population, right? And again, that raises the question of those numbers have dropped so far that there's federal funding available for schools that are qualified as ANAPISI. That's they're at least 10% of the student population has to be Asian American, Pacific Islander, or Native American. So CSUN was an ANAPISI serving institution, but those numbers have to be above 10%. Of the undergraduate population. CSUN's no longer there. So again, that raises the issue of what sort of programming is available for these students, and what sort of personnel are available to meet these students, to recruit and retain them, and are they really better served? All right, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. I'll turn this over now to some of our wonderful CSUN undergraduates.
Hi, everybody. I can get started. First of all, I want to thank you to the panelists for sharing your expertise and your experiences. I can really identify with many of the sentiments that were shared, from the model minority myth to my own Asian body being fetishized and not viewing this as a problem. The ethnic studies and AAPI courses have really given me the lens to understand this, and it's been formative in my understanding and my journey of decolonizing. I am, like many of you, I am heartbroken and I'm angered by the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing. And as Dr. Kim pointed out, it's the women, it's the elderly, it's the working class, it's the linguistically isolated folks who are facing the brunt of this violence. And that's why we're having this conversation. So thank you. And Manju also touched on the necessity of coalition building across communities. And I think that it's really important to remember that our liberation is really interconnected among all oppressed communities and all BIPOC communities. And it's important that we're building relationships and collaborating. And a lot of my anti-racist work and a lot of my organizing is with the unhoused community, but I also do work with a new group that we're building out right now. It's called Third World Power. And this is a non-Black people of color abolitionist group that works autonomously, but in partnership with BLMLA. And Third World Power is really a nod to the Third World Liberation Front that rose in 1968, which was a coalition of ethnic student groups that were really fighting against the Eurocentric education that they were seeing in institutions and the lack of diversity. So that's something that we are working towards. And, when we think third world power, we think, the first world is the world of the capitalists. The second world is really the world of the reformists. But the third world, that's the world of the liberators. That's the world that we're dreaming and that we're trying to reimagine. And that's why we're having these race conscious conversations. As far as holding the university accountable, I want to say that budgets are really a reflection of our priorities. And so I want to make sure that we are being mindful that we're giving the resources that our AAPI students need. Unfortunately, because of the model minority myth that we talked about, it's often assumed that AAPI students don't need resources. And this is not true. Students, we need mental health resources, we need funding, we need opportunities, and that data that Dr. Lai showed, that shows that there needs to be more staff and more resources that's dedicated to serving our communities. I also wanted to talk about, we can appreciate the conversation and the awareness that's being brought to our community issues at a university level, but how are we moving past awareness and acknowledgement to action, right? Because a lot of times our community issues, they are looked on by other folks with a lot of apathy. And what we want to do is really center our experiences, and the opposite of apathy is empathy. And I would hope that that empathy would drive us to compassion and then hopefully to action, right? So educational institutions, first and foremost, I would think would need to acknowledge the centuries of harmful legislation and policies and discrimination that historically our AAPI communities have faced. And they need to not only show support to our students, but also to our AAPI faculty and staff. And I think what that looks like to me is CSUN, really taking it upon themselves to provide knowledge about BIPOC histories. And what that looks like in a tangible way might be, requiring students to take multi-ethnic study courses that dive into the racism and the discrimination and the violence that the AAPI community faces now, but also from a historical perspective. And oftentimes, our community is not included around conversations of race. Instead, we are marginalized. And those microaggressions are really just an extension of the systemic racism that needs to be addressed at the university level. And I think while we need to also be making sure that these classes and these resources are available to students, we also need to carry that over to faculty and staff and administrators. We need to make sure that they are making a long-term commitment to being anti-racist, and that's a verb, not an adjective, making sure that our classes are integrating culturally competent curriculum that are inclusive of our histories and our stories. I shouldn't have been in school and never learned anything about my culture until I got to Dr. Lai's class. That shouldn't have been the case. And it's really important for those faculty and staff who haven't had those experiences to listen to those of us who have. And in doing that, we need to mandate those professional development, and it needs to be a continuous effort that the faculty and administrators are taking those professional multicultural ethnic studies trainings that are anti-racist and that really involve issues that are affecting our communities, instead of looking at race as this black and white issue, and really address the internalized racial ideas that are inherently absorbed from living in a racist society. And if we don't do this, if we don't make this a priority, unfortunately, the way that I as a student see it is we're really just restructuring that racism. And another thing, just to close out my thoughts, I have a lot more, but just to say is that we also need to be making sure that we are investing money and into programs that are supporting ethnic studies in the K through 12, so that we are building those communities, and education is a huge part of it. So that's what I will share.
That was outstanding. Thank you, Serena. Actually, we're going to change up the program just a little bit. Hannah, actually, if you wouldn't mind speaking now, and then Skylar, we'll hear from you and Asian American Studies Pathways program.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Serena. Thank you for all that. You really have a great flow, and thank you for your thoughts and understanding and just trying to find a solution, as we all are. I just want to share a really fast PowerPoint. I'll go fast, I swear. Thank you everyone for being here. I just put something together because that's kind of how my thoughts were a little. So Just want to talk about how we can support Pacific Islander students. And then I just want to show everyone what Pacific Islander consists of. And it's basically these, just to like clarify for the audience and everyone. And then also just a little bit about me. You know, you're average kind of 22-year-old from Long Beach, a place that, you know, there's a big population of Polynesians, kind of move around city to city, you know, having a single mom and 6 of us kids, and then getting ready for college. It was kind of like, you know, I wasn't ready. I didn't have the resources or parental guidance to really help me get through it. But, you know, I kind of landed in college. And, you know, I was scared to go to other college, ATL, Washington, things like that. Wanted to be close to the family as the oldest. And then now this year I'm graduating, and it's kind of, you know, it went really fast. And I think I, you know, enjoyed being at CSUN because of my professors, Professor Lai, the CDSC organization, Jenna, you know, has really made me really comfortable and always provided resources, and Hanum, and I thank you so much. And then after college, I just want to network, and my goal is to become a business professional. So that's kind of like my little background as a PI student at CSUN. You know, I just want to go into like what's stopping like Pacific Islanders and students in general. We see that there's, you know, there's a small number of Pacific Islanders getting to college, but they're not able to get a degree, or they don't graduate. Sorry, that's the printer. And then these are kind of like the different forces behind why that is so. And then, you know, there might not be like a lot of, you know, hate crimes or documented things like that, but there are like, there's a lot of crime underneath stereotypes, whether it comes to image, your skills, being intellectual. So this is like things as I've grown up, you know, I've seen like stereotypes and myth, like I don't even eat pork and things like that. And it's just been, you know, just something that kind of like people have to pay attention to be able to understand what, you know, Pacific Islander student is going as a student and as a person. I really like this quote. I think there's a lot of power. Students taught by teachers who share their identities and look like them benefit both academically and emotionally. There's a lot of truth to that. You know, growing up, I didn't have like one teacher or professor who's Pacific Islander, but I've seen, you know, many students or teachers that look out for students of the same and you know, and emotionally, things like that. Not having parents at home to like encourage, you know, that's a big thing. Like, you know, PI parents don't really want their students to go to school, but get a job and take care of them right away. And then I also think that we can start here at CSUN, like Professor Lai was showing, you know, the data and how it's like the numbers are decreasing for students and staff at CSUN, and things we can do such as activities. We can bring Pacific Islander studies initiatives and all kind of support with mental health to be able to get to these high places. And then this is just a bunch of resources. I found educational resources and things for Pacific Islander studies, excuse me, for Asian Pacific Islanders. And thank you so much. I just want to share that, go over that.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for your powerful testimony, and you know, about reminding CSUN that it needs to see its Pacific Islander students and to meet the needs of those students and their communities. 46 students is not enough. These students are underrepresented in higher education, and they need, you know, culturally competent, you know, instructors, and also school personnel working in student affairs and the USU and that sort of thing. Thank you so much. Now we turn to Skylar Hall. who is with the Asian American Studies Pathways Project. Skylar?
Hi, everyone. I first want to thank, everyone for their testimony. Serena and Hannah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Y'all put it so well into words, and I'm honored to be in a room and to be given this platform, and I want to acknowledge that first. But I think starting, with the experience of being Asian American, being in the AAPI community, what's so central in our experience is that we are invalidated and invisible in all spaces, including even our own. We are taught from a very young age to be subservient and to be complicit and to just stay under the radar. And so even when discussing these issues in these spaces within our own families, within our own communities, that can be very difficult. And to hear from my personal experience being inundated with so many social media posts, so many even people that I know invalidating AAPI oppression, and hearing all these think pieces about, invalidating our experiences, it hurts, because for us, there's no central hub sometimes to even discuss these or things, or to even be validated. And so I think that's really important to preface. And kind of moving on, and relating that to my experience in AASPP, Asian American Studies Pathways Project, we are one of, if not the only AAPI specific student resources on campus, and we are a tentative service. We rely completely upon the CQF, the campus quality fee, and even then people can opt out of that, right? And every single year for Asian American Studies Pathways Project, we have to apply for funding. Every single year, we are at risk of not being on campus anymore, of not being that central hub anymore. And I want to reaffirm the need for institutional support of AAPI student resources at CSUN. Speaking from Serena's point on budgets, previously we had a $50,000 budget, and in the past 2 years that's decreased to $46,000. A lot of that money goes to paying our student interns, and we have a very limited budget to actually put on these student activities, to run the Glenn Omatsu House, to serve as that primary center and safe space and advocacy space for AAPI students. And just recently, we had multiple healing space events. We've also had a Tell Your Story narrative event that we collaborated with the Modern Moranix podcast event to really amplify and reaffirm AAPI identity and our experiences. And where do I even start on some of the experiences that we heard from students and from faculty who attended these events? The pure emotion, the raw emotion, the grief, the anger, really makes me emotional and broke my heart. And knowing that we as a university who championed the Third World Liberation Movement, who championed ethnic studies in a time of extreme oppression and unrest, it is very disheartening to see that we don't have those material changes, those material resources for our AAPI students. And further tying into that, and even just being acknowledged by the administration, I understand that there was a statement made on CSUN today, I believe, re-acknowledging and rehashing our healing space that we had, and the university really reaffirming that they are with us. But what AAPI students fundamentally want, and what their needs that they vocalize to us, is they want material change and material support to protect AAPI students. And that's where I think something is fundamentally missing. To not hear ways in which we are to be protected, and to hear, quite honestly, a rehashing of our emotional trauma and emotional labor we had to put through in that event, was a little bit discouraging. And I think from what the university can do is really reassuring that we have institutional funding and institutional protections for AAPI resources, to amplify Pacific Islander voices, to acknowledge disaggregated data that points that not all AAPIs are the same, and that's something that's fundamentally missing. AAPIs have some of the lowest passing rates for the upper division writing exam. AAPI student enrollment has been decreasing very, very much so. And although I am so blessed to be in an incredible Asian American Studies department that does offer some of that support, our Asian American Studies department is struggling with some capacity and with funding and with allocating resources within the department itself. And a lot of people have to take multiple hats because of that, because of the lack of resources, because of this invalidation, et cetera. And so really reaffirming that the university, we as AAPIs want representation, but not and validation. I understand that that's totally necessary, but we also need material change to happen. We need material protection from the university, and we need an allocation of resources to quite honestly, and disaggregation to quite honestly get rid of the model minority myth that is existing within our institution and that is reinforcing this AAPI experience at CSUN. And, you know, really to wrap up, I participated in an AAPI cultural talk for newly admitted students. And so many people were asking, what are resources at CSUN for AAPIs and specifically for Pacific Islander students? And other than AAS pathways, I didn't know how to respond. And I think that that says a lot of the gravity of the situation. And so I think reaffirming that we aren't a model minority and reaffirming that we are a student body that is in desperate need of assistance, whether that be an EOP, whether that be through via student tutoring or culturally specific services on campus, I really reaffirm there is a need for that, and not only a need for that, but a need for protection from the university and that reaffirmation from the administration. And yeah, thank you for giving me this space. I appreciate it.
Thank you everybody for these really powerful testimonies and these really eloquent sort of articulations of your experience, and also what solutions could look like very locally at CSUN. You know, we are going to run a little bit over time, but we are open for Q&A now, actually. So if you can stick around, and if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. And so we're just going to open for conversation. There is a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and I'll start us off with one. There's a comment from Rebecca, which I don't know if everybody can see the Q&A. The whole, is that, no? Well, how about I'll just read Rebecca's comment, and Edith, maybe you could take the next, lead us to the next question. Rebecca wrote that as a person who is Nigerian American first generation, when a police officer sees me, they presume me as a Black person. And I know I have to learn to embody and sympathize with the African American community like I would do with my own race. This enlightenment has helped me to be supportive of all races, religions, genders, and classes who deal with hate. And for that, the API community has my support in this fight for love instead of hate. AAPI hate must and will not stop bringing awareness. Thank you for your comment, Rebecca.
Should I read the next question?
Sure, Edith, you can read it, or I can.
Okay, you go ahead.
Okay, this question is from Kaylee, and it's not addressed to any specific panelists, but the question says, in what ways do you validate, bring light to your experience as Asian Americans without centering yourself in conversations with other BIPOC communities or folks?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think it's really important to recognize that it's not an oppression Olympics at all. Like, we all have our own different issues that we're dealing with in different communities, and we need to make sure that we recognize that we're all fighting against the same thing, and white supremacy is detrimental and harmful to all of our communities. And I think something that is really good is maybe making your own community where you can have those race conscious conversations. For example, something that Third World Power does is when we organize with BLMLA, one of the things that we do is we have breakout meetings, and there will be meetings for Black folks, and then there will be meetings for a group for the non-Black people of color, which is third world power. And then we have meetings for white people. And just because it's also not our job to educate other people, they need to take like responsibility for that. And I think that making sure that you have those spaces would help maybe not center us. I don't know if someone else wants to add on to that.
I think adding on to that, it's not, you're so right. You know, it is about not centering ourselves, but also about realizing that there are fundamentally differing experiences that each BIPOC community has to experience that outsiders, whether if you're a BIPOC or not, will never understand. And I think that's very important in the conversation too, and understanding that even though we may not understand that, to validate that and to center that experience and to stand in solidarity with that. And that when we do this work, remembering the power of solidarity and remembering that to always look inwards on yourself and to always center, you know, differing experiences and to validate that and to really come into unity to work against white supremacy, because unity and solidarity are our only options to fight white supremacy, but definitely.
Should I move us to some of the next question? Gina Mesekesme is asking, will the president and the provost have a chance to see excerpts of the students' testimonies and a summary of the needs and demands? Well, yeah, we're recording. This is being recorded, correct? Yeah. So this event is being recorded, and I do think that there have been representatives in the audience from the provost and somebody from the president's office. But if they would like to respond directly, you know, that response can be, oh, the provost just responded saying, I have been here the entire time. So yeah, so that's great. I guess that they are having a chance to, and if you'd like to respond, provost, you feel free to put it in the chat also. Robert is asking also, at CSUN, what are the ways we can be involved in budget processes to support AAPI students?
I think coming from Asian American Studies pathways, I think that, you know, obviously, you know, we as students don't handle our budgeting, our advisors do, but regardless, I think visibility is just, I know that sounds so cliche, but visibility and standing in solidarity. I understand that that isn't direct action towards budgeting, that isn't directly speaking on that, but giving visibility to these campus services and these resources that desperately need funding, that need material support from the university, I think is one. Pathways is not really well known, even within the Asian American Studies department. We throw out some scholars. And so, and we are on the edge of campus. And so visibility for us would be incredible. And it adds to our support of advocating for more funding and advocating for more visibility from university admins, but definitely showing solidarity and support in the services that need it and giving material support and action towards those said services, definitely.
You know, and I can address this a little bit. You know, I will say that my response is sadly cynical, because this is my fourth institution, and at every institution I have been at, the needs of Asian American students and Asian American studies has never been a priority. And our departments have often been subject to, you know, to the needs of, for example, serving GE students, for example, you know, never allowed to grow for ourselves or to exist for ourselves, but to respond to this sort of colonizing rhetoric that, you know, you have to meet, you know, a certain number of seats in the classroom. And so I have never been in an institution that has supported Asian American studies, and this seems to be a US university-wide phenomena. And from what I'm hearing from, you know, I'm in communication studies, and I've often told Clem this, it's really quite amazing to me, having come from a private university like Northwestern University, where I was in an Asian American Studies program, I am just shocked by how the privilege of being in a non-ethnic studies program gives me this kind of stability. I never worry about budgets. We never worry about, we never have the same kind of worries that that you have in ethnic studies program. And so I want to put that out there. And then, one of the things that Hanum and I have particularly learned recently in organizing around caregiving is that we need to be demanding a seat at the table around budgets, especially right now as the university is figuring out ways to distribute the CARES Act, which has a large chunk of money that's devoted specifically to students. We need to be insisting that these funds be specifically marked for the kind of traumas and invisibility and institutional poverty, that Asian American API students and other students of color feel, and to ask for that to be explicitly a priority. And as far as I can tell, there's no space for that. We are not invited to be a part of that discussion. We're invited to apply for grants and things, but we're not invited to come and say, how is it exactly, what is it that you need? And then I think, finally, I think, all of the students and, and the faculty talked about this, but, Asian American communities suffer from being aggregated, being lumped together as a single coherent category, without being disaggregated. And this is a question that I have brought up many times, and the response that I've gotten is, oh, we're working on that. At one point, we will figure out the different groups of Asian American communities. Yes, we will address, the Pacific Islander communities, but I've been here for 5 years, and the response has always been, oh, we'll get to it. And I'm sure that Edith and Clem, and I feel silly talking about this, I'm sure Edith and Clem and the members of the Asian American Studies faculty in the audience are familiar with this, so you have to it's a very concrete thing that you can do to disaggregate that data, and to provide more resources for our ethnic studies departments.
One thing that I would like to add to this conversation, I think that we're living in challenging times, but this is also an opportunity to build off what we've started 31 years ago. 31 years ago was the birth of the Asian American Studies Department. As Professor Lai said, that is the first in Southern California, and that is the second in the nation. And we have an opportunity. I'm so inspired by all the students' comments. In terms of, and it's time to kind of look at the university's values and mission. I think I'm hearing that, I heard a lot of statements from different academic units, from the president's office, in terms of wanting to stand in solidarity with Asian American and Pacific Islander students. And just building off what the students have says, well, how can we get there, and how can those resources be kind of more in line, I believe, with what the university, I want to say this is what the direction the university wants to head in. And I would like to I would say as a starting point, let's look at some of the things that our other sister universities are doing. So there was a HEDA center that was established just this year at San Diego State University, and they don't even have an Asian American Studies department. At San Francisco State, they have dedicated programming to retention, to mentoring. And I put those links in there, so if you can take a look at it. And I'm thinking that is something perhaps that we can learn, we can have conversations with, and maybe we can, and I hope that we can, this is, again, just one of many conversations that I think are necessary, that we should be having in our campus community. Hanum, if you want to take the next one, read the next question, or if anyone wants to contribute to that.
Okay, I can read the next question. This one's from Mike Terry with the San Fernando Sun, actually. Mike Terry is commenting, this is a unique moment in history. Besides legislation, do any of you see more demonstrations like the one in downtown Los Angeles 3 weeks ago? What sorts of mobilizations at the local level nationally do you see continuing? I'm adding on a little bit there.
I apologize if you can hear music in the background. My grandparents are banging out to Japanese music right now, but in regards to organizing and mobilizing, nothing is set in stone right now, but one of the goals of Asian American Studies Pathways Project that we really want to implement is advocacy, right? And direct action and material action. And so we as an organization branch out to other external organizations, not at just at CSUN, but in the community. That includes Anakbayan Los Angeles, advocating for the removal of US imperialism in the Philippines, and other community-based organizations that are taking direct action and that are supporting these communities. And so really, you know, as the Pathways Project, you know, we hope that throughout the semester and in the near future, we can reach out to more organizations in order to really mobilize and create a grassroots community-led effort that prioritizes our needs and prioritizes mutual aid and direct collective action. And so I think in regards to that, you know, we really do want to get the ball rolling on that. And I am someone who is a firm believer in direct action and advocacy. And so in regards to that, I know that's not a national movement, but in regards to community-led movements, that is something that that is definitely on the radar for us, for sure.
Anyone else want to field the question? I did put it in the chat.
You know, just really briefly, I think that this moment is amazing. The Asian American community, API community is working. It's the movement that is growing, that is intersectional, that's calling for abolition, the end to policing, for community-based solutions, the rise of grassroots organizing, the kind of intersectional work, like you point out, Skylar, pointing to the links between racism in the US and US imperialist wars in Asia. This is a really rich moment that is also just being led by such a broad group of people. And so I'm not sure about the demonstration but you're talking about, but yes, this is a moment in which Asian American community is really redefining itself in just the broadest of ways to respond collectively, and in ways also that attend to our own healing. You know, it's a care-based, relationship-based, a movement that is thoughtful to speak to anti-Black violence, for example, to settler colonialisms, to all of these intersectionalities.
I think that our event was supposed to go till 12:15. I think that's 12:15. I think we said on the flyer, but we knew we would go over actually. I wanna, it's 12:45, and you know, to be respectful of everybody's time, I really appreciate all the panelists and what you brought. I think this was a really needed and a really powerful discussion at this particular moment. And I do hope that, and I believe that this will be sort of one of many. Just actually day before yesterday, there was another conversation around around these issues also. And so it's exciting to hear this and to discuss possible solutions at CSUN, within our larger communities, and sort of in a larger you know, national and global way. Like, I think it's really important for us to continue to have these spaces. Students, you're so eloquent, and your analyses are so profound. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Edith. Thank you, Vivian, Hannah, and Jason, for all the support that you provide. Thank you to the participants for sticking around this long. Clearly, there's a need for this conversation to be happening, for folks to be staying this long over time, and for this large of an attendance. We threw this event together fairly quickly, actually. And so it's a testimony to how much this conversation is needed. So with that, there is, I think Vivian has posted the survey right in the chat. Is that correct, Vivian? I think so. It's in the chat. If you've attended this event, we would really appreciate it if you could just take a moment to fill out the survey. With that, thank you so much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
I'd just like to put a plug that there will be another conversation on anti-Asian violence with a workshop component to continue to discuss about solutions. I hope that you can attend. I put the information in the chat. That will be next Thursday. This is being hosted by Lobby Corps of the Associated Students. So I hope to see some of you there.
I did put this in the chat earlier, but there's a really great event coming up as well, which is called Gender, Race, and Germs in the U.S. National Security Imaginary, Constructing Threat, Making Empire. It's a talk by Dr. Gwen Shuni Darkangelis, and who's the author of a book called Disease, Terror, and the Construction of National Fragility, Bioimperialism. And I'll put that in the chat right again. It's on April 28th. So that's another really relevant and important event if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hanum and Clem, for organizing. And Serena, Hannah, and Skylar, you guys are amazing. You really need to become the president of the world and or start at a university and then hire me to work in that university, and I'll do whatever you ask. It would be amazing. Basically, you just should tell us what to do and then we'll just do it.
Yeah, I want to, also say, thank you so much for giving me this space to really have a platform and talk about these issues. I'm so honored to be surrounded by such incredible scholars and peers and just a community that is so willing to have these conversations and to create spaces like this. And it really just means so much. And I want to thank just everyone here. I really am so honored. I'm really at a loss for words. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, like Skylar was saying, like a place to actually express, because there's not many places at all, that want to listen or accommodate. So thank you, everyone, for organizing this, the directors and panelists and people that have been trying to build this from the ground up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to echo what my other two student peers are saying. I agree. It's incredible to be in conversation with you all about such an important topic and with all of your expertise. So thank you for making space for this.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for being on the panel and educating us and mentoring us and showing us possibilities, for being powerful. I'm going to stop recording.
I also